Album 25 from King Gizzard is a techno project titled The Silver Chord. The album is made to specifically complement the tracklist from Petrodragonic Apocalypse, reusing melodies and core motifs from each song to build new tracks in a different light. The band succeeds in creating a record that showcases a thoughtful approach to structuring the silver chord, but its concept is handled too superficially, greatly hindering the music that could have been so much more. To begin this video, I'd like to address how this is a direction King Gizzard have been going with their music for quite some time now. One of the key reasons for me making this video is to talk about album structure from a somewhat broader standpoint. While I'm aware that there's no rule set for creating music, and that music platforms only exist due to the limitations of the commercial music industry, there's something to be said in terms of pushing an album's agenda versus crafting a collection of songs that speak for something larger than the sum of its parts. Before diving in further, I'm going to admit that I do enjoy this record, and that this is in no way a video made to be reductive of the sheer volume of effort put into producing this album. I've also chosen to wait until the end of the most recent AMA to collect some extraneous information that seems pertinent to the discussion as it comes from the creators themselves. In their live AMA on r/indieheads, they admitted that perfectionism has never been a goal of their work, and I get the feeling that such a mindset doesn't truly fit in King Gizzard's workflow. That being said, I feel that it's important to specify that the problems I have with the Silver Chord's standard and extended editions are linked to something less trivial than the semantics of defining a finished product. My problems with the Silver Chord are embedded in the sheer lack of reaching the potential that more time and consideration would have warranted, given the ambitious musical and lyrical links between albums 24 and 25. Just real quick to catch those up who may be unaware, the Petro album and the Silver Chord were created to be a yin and yang double concept experience, if you will. The two albums are not only linked thematically, akin to Infest the Rat's Nest and Fishing for Fishies, but 7 core tracks share melodic and lyrical content through the recontextualization of material from Petrodragonic Apocalypse. As this is a confirmed aspect of these albums, I'm not going to dive too deeply into showcasing these connections themselves, as they are better experienced by listening to them for yourself. Limiting themselves to purely a lineup of electronic gear, King Gizzard set out to create within that limitation, as they often are creating inside of some kind of bubble with rules that fit each respective project. This would all be fine in theory, given that the band chooses to follow through on their actions. However, when finally giving the two records a full listen multiple times, I can't say that I think the band took all capable measures to make these albums speak to one another in a well-considered way. Take the album transition to begin with, coming out of Flamethrower's techno outro and linking the Motor Spirit motif. What feels like the perfect setup for returning to Motor Spirit in order to connect sonically to the beginning of Thea, which reuses the opening guitar riff, is wasted on a transition that feels incomplete and lacks some intention of connecting the two in the first place. This, as well as all of my issues, are solely objective, and I wouldn't expect everyone to share my sentiment. However, to me these problems speak so clearly to the potential these albums had. Here's another example of an idea that wasn't even mine to begin with. Maybe this helps bring in some balance, as it isn't solely my own opinion if that kind of thing matters to you. Many fans online were speculating that if these two stories aren't meant to be an extension of one another, but rather a retelling through a different perspective or another character's point of view, that Extinction, the final track of the Silver Chord, would play a similar card, turning into a heavy, guitar-based outro with acoustic drums that reinstate its connection to Motor Spirit. While some may argue that this approach might have felt forced or predictable, I would say that making an effort to have these two albums start and stop by leading into one another would have made the entire experience feel more meaningful with its description as a yin and yang project. I do think it is the listener's responsibility to manage their expectations when information like this is leaked ahead of time, whether it be from the artist or from the fanbase itself, but I also think that this is a prime example of King Gizzard working too quickly for themselves. The fact that so many people made this claim about the two records makes me think that it's likely that the idea occurred to them during production. I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt to consider that maybe they did try this idea and it just wasn't fitting, but that in itself goes against the limitless ethos outlined by the band since its inception. That's probably enough discussion about the speculative aspects of what this project could or could not have been. I would normally put these sorts of thoughts at the end half of my videos, but I think that the context is important for approaching the songs themselves. Saying that the Silver Chord's 7 tracks are shallower material than their sister songs off Petro would be underselling the experience. I have to give credit to the band for working within such stressed limitations even greater than those used to create Butterfly 3000, even if tracks such as Thea and Changa sound like they came straight from that pipeline. The band at least takes measures to ease the listener into newer forms of experimentation, point in case with the Silver Chord title track and set. These two songs, while somewhat repetitive with little growth on the back half, explore new territory within the already established sound. This is commendable for an album with such a potentially broad scope, all while tackling the techno genre. The cold truth of the matter is how misleading these opening songs are towards establishing any kind of development in King Gizzard's sound whatsoever. Sure, Swan Song is a keeper with some noteworthy delivery and serves as an exciting sister to Dragon, especially in its extended version. But most all of the other tracks feel overly predictable and too basic to do enough justice to their sister songs off Petro. One might argue that this is the focal message of the album. If Petro Dragonic Apocalypse is detailing accounts of striving to save the world from its own destruction through the most fantastical and unlikely means, perhaps the Silver Chord's message is about submission to the evils of humanity through some kind of spiritual actualization. While it's a stretch that actually makes sense given the lyrical content across the album, I find that it's a little too convenient to feel intentional as the core theme of the album. This type of point might have been justifiable had the band made the choice to craft as well considered an album as Petro, using spaces within songs for more intimate, jam-esque moments, all while fueling the momentum that the narrative requires to continue the story. This idea in theory could have resulted in a longer form album like the extended editions, but the content would have been packed meaningfully inside. Instead, the end result feels like an afterthought, which recently I discovered isn't too far from the truth. On their most recent Indie Heads AMA, the band shared a little about the creation process. In their description, they mentioned that shaping the shorter versions was finished first, even though they had begun to record the longer versions already. Once the short album was complete, they went back and finished the longer version. While it sounds like an interesting idea in theory, I would have much preferred an experience on par with the structural integrity of Petro, especially since the two albums have so much to do with one another, both sonically and lyrically. In short, it feels to me as though they've underserved themselves when the opportunity to make the Silver Chord a memorable album was sitting before them on a hypothetical platter. The most hard-hitting point for me is that the chosen approach might have felt more intuitive had they decided not to link these two records. If the Silver Chord spoke more for itself, it could have presented a plethora of new ideas that weren't mildly reminiscent of an album that had just been released. I'm getting further down the rabbit hole of objective viewpoints than I'd like to be, so I'm going to wrap up my thoughts on this topic. I understand perfectly well that King Gizzard is a band that takes an idea and runs with it. When it's finished, it means it's time to move on, but less reflection seems to take place in the context of their later discography. The linked concept between Petro Dragonic Apocalypse and the Silver Chord is an interesting idea, but the way it was executed leaves much more to be desired than the spurts of lyrical and melodic motifs that never seem to scratch that itch of intended meaning. At the end of the day, King Gizzard has always been upfront about doing what they want and not worrying too much about the end result as long as they reach their goal of finishing a project. To be completely transparent, it's a refreshing approach that I wish more artists took as a creative liberty when releasing music especially. By in some ways failing to follow through on their own ambitious ideas, they are continuously able to find success, but to a greater point, they're able to find peace with themselves as artists. There's definitely pressure that comes with the goal of making great art, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way either, given that you don't put an immeasurable amount of stock into the thing you're making. In a previous video, I spent over an hour criticizing how King Gizzard's increasingly laid-back production techniques have hindered the quality of their work in recent years. However, maybe that's missing the point entirely. Perhaps there lies more merit in getting to that point where you cut yourself off from the world of commercial success or decisions that could have heightened an experience. But these decisions weren't forced because it was never that big of a deal to begin with. Just as well, this could all be a far-fetched excuse for becoming less ambitious or generally comfortable in their stable position as a band. I made this video for the reason I make all my videos. I'm curious to see what others think about these ideas and to ask more broadly what value truly exists in the art that we consume. For some, perfectionism is a contrived subject, riddled with its own semantic loopholes designed to trap creative minds that allow the fear of failure to pierce through to their work. For others, it may be an opportunity for greatness, with a clear path marked by inspiration and the motivation to create. The most important question here is why, but this question also begs one equally valid truth, and that is the stinging realization that while why may apply to some artists, it in many cases is not applicable to others. If you stuck around until the end, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.